Good afternoon. This is Mike Smullen, Executive Director of Alumni Relations at New Jersey Institute of Technology, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our newest webinar, How to Nail Your Virtual Interview. Before I get started, I want to introduce our distinguished panelists today. I'm very pleased to welcome Manish Advani, class of 2000, who's a partner at Icon Media. Daniel Cerrone, 2013, from the Honors College as well, Systems Application Engineer, Schneider Electric. Robert Cohen, class of 83, 84, and 87, Vice President of Global R&D and the Chief Technology Officer at Stryker Orthopedics. Pat Natal, class of 1970 and 75, Senior Vice President of Business Strategies at Mott MacDonald. Carlos Orozco, class of 2006, also from the Honors College, Director and Actuary at Prudential Financial. Joseph Racanelli, class of 1983 and 90, Senior Director, Stryker Orthopedics. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Steven Saperstein, class of 1984, former COO, PGIM Fixed Income. Gentlemen, thanks very much all for joining me today. I'm going to start with a question to Steve and to Robert Cohen. Gents, what we've got here is a whole society that's kind of changed over in terms of how interviews work and what we're using. But I want to start with the basic question of, is a virtual interview any different at all from a physical interview, or should we really look at them as fundamentally the same thing?
Well, my experience is they're fundamentally not any different. You need to demonstrate a passion for what you're interested in. You need to understand the subject matter of the position that you're applying for. So, an interviewer is going to judge you based on what you say, how you can talk about the details, how you talk about your experiences. So fundamentally, it's the same thing. So, in that regard, maybe a little more difficult to get that across virtually, but, it's all about preparation and knowing your resume and being able to talk to it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Steve, actually, and thanks for doing this, Mike. It's a great topic, especially in these difficult times. From my perspective, you can absolutely make it the same way, but it's not perfectly the same, right? The person who's doing the interview, it's new to them on how to interview it, and the person on the other side who's being interviewed, there's a couple things that there are a couple watch outs. For instance, you're more observing. You're not in an office setting where you have normal banter back and forth, so sometimes it's not as conversational. Your background actually makes a big difference. How prepared you are, your words, and people are looking at your face, your facial expression, your professionalism, how you're dressed, which now, and not in an office environment, is meaningful, but it's so important, though, so important. Where I've seen people nail the virtual interview is where they had very succinct answers and very succinct responses and very clear, and didn't go on and on for a long period of time. So the objective is to make it the same, but to actually see the person, now you have more visuals, right? Where you're making an assessment on person at home, maybe, than you wouldn't have normally had, but also a little more preparation in the interview, even more than would have done before, to give those succinct answers. And you're not walking through the company. You're not necessarily going to get company history. Know the company you're talking to, know the background of the company, know their successes, understand what your contribution could be, and be very, very, very direct and be very succinct in your responses. Those win. And in reality, sometimes you get better answers through a virtual interview for the person that's better prepared.
So, I find that interesting because when you look at most interviews, or what we're probably all used to, you're already in the office environment, 20 minutes before, a half hour before, an hour before. You're already locked into that mindset. When you're doing a virtual interview, if you're not correctly prepared, you're sort of falling into it immediately. You turn a key and suddenly you're in front of a bunch of people. There's a lot of mental preparation that I imagine would go into that. So bear that in mind, because we're going to come back around to that from the interviewer side in a little bit. Robert, Steve, thanks so much for answering that. So my next question is going to go to Carlos Orozco and Manish Advani. It ties in a lot with what Robert and Steve were just talking about, body language. So body language is such an important part of in-person interviews. How do you judge body language when sometimes the only thing you're actually seeing may be a face. So, Carlos, why don't we go ahead and start with you? How would you determine body language when you're doing the virtual interview?
Yeah, so a lot of it, in my opinion, has to do with tone of the person, right? Because of the setting that we're in, you have your voice that really energizes the communication. So I actually found it very elegant when a person walks me through, let's say I ask a question and they say, oh, as you could see in this section in my resume, I have this, this project that I did. And they walk me through the example, maybe a minute or two through that experience, as if I was them, right? I get energized by their experience, and they tell me the details that I feel like I was there. So that to me emphasizes that you were actually telling a very good story, and I think projects energy and passion for what you're talking about. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, particularly in this setting, so that just people have the best shot at the interview. Manish?
So in my case, it would be, facial expressions, which play a very important role, what kind of energy they're displaying. In addition to that, tone plays a major role, and also the words which they use. A combination of three: facial expression, tone, and the words, is something which makes a big difference in, how the candidate is presenting himself or herself during the interview which we have.
All right, so I always like doing this in interviews, the smiles, laugh a little bit, see if you can get some kind of connection. Is that something that you recommend? Because if you do it and it's not organic, I think you can probably tell pretty well on video interviews. So is there some way where you sort of have to speak with the body language? Manish, to your point, do these things play together, or can you master one skill on its own and then kind of come up with a good end result?
So
I would say, all three. I mean, in the world of communication, body language plays, I believe, 55%, and tone plays 38% role, and words play 7%. But in the virtual environment, when you don't have access to the full kind of, to judge on the basis of body language, you have to embark on the other two. I mean, rely on the other two and make the most out of it. So I would say a combination, I mean, we can't expect the person who's giving the interview to change. It's we who have to change the way we look at them.
Yep. One thing I would also suggest to candidates is, everybody's got a phone. People can record themselves and actually practice an answer for the, put the phone in your car or whatever it is to actually record yourself and practice and see if it's a story that you will listen to it. You could see the little things that you're doing slightly wrong, like looking away from the camera or whatever may happen. But I think practice makes perfect. So I think it's pretty useful to do that.
All right, gentlemen, thanks for that. So my next question is about Zoom and WebEx and Google Meet exhaustion. I think pretty much everybody at this point has spent hours and hours and hours, probably far more than they've spent before, on videos, video interviewing, and so on. Certainly in a work setting, probably in a personal setting as well. How do you deal with that? And really, have you experienced it well? And here I'm going to ask Joe Racanelli and Dan Cerrone, because I know the two of you are doing this pretty much constantly. So have you experienced that exhaustion? And how much time do you think is appropriate to spend on a virtual interview versus an in-person interview?
So I can go first, Dan. So first, I spend days on days here on Zoom, and for me, it's wonderful to be able to continue kind of all the work that we do, but it is a different environment. It can be challenging. With regard to, I guess, guidance for students, I would say don't be shy about using the time you have. Most companies dictate timing for interviews, and I can just share with you briefly. We set up long interviews on the premise that bringing talent into our organization, is really one of the most important things we do. So we go really through, quite long effort to screen and evaluate people. Typically, we start off with a half-hour, 45-minute presentation of let's say, an applicant's choice on a technical subject. And then we target half-hour interviews after that, but each of those interviews is focused on an individual aspect that's critical for the role. So interviews may be a half hour, but you think of them in aggregate, that as a student or as an interviewee, you're competing with everybody else who we bring in for that position. And there's, in some cases, 6 or 7 different facets we're interviewing for. And, so those interviews aren't just with team members, they're targeted on specific performance issues or areas of focus that we feel are relevant for that topic. And I guess the last point I'll make with regard to timing is that, I'm happy to go over my time slot in interview if you've heard it, if a student or if an interviewee is prepared, they're engaged, they're enthusiastic, they have questions, and they're obviously relevant questions about the business, the industry, et cetera. So, to me, it's one way to demonstrate, for example, enthusiasm, preparation, and organization, which I think are critical for setting yourself apart.
So I did also want to mention that I actually have been sitting on the other side, on the virtual side. So I've actually experienced what it's like to do a virtual interview, and I've done it a couple times. And it's kind of what I say, I guess, that when we do the resume writing at NJIT, what I usually mention to people, I said, tell the story. What is your story? What are you trying to achieve? What's your passion? What's your goals? And really let it shine through, right? Okay, Zoom and everything else, like we do this a lot, right? Even for my work, like I'm on Teams constantly, or I'm remoting into things constantly, and then I'm on a call with other people. It's IT world, right? What I would say is that you can make it still exciting, right? You could still make it interesting and still make the conversation fun. Probably don't show up with an NJIT t-shirt on, although maybe they'll like that. I don't know. I'm doing it for the look, but but still, make it fun. I mean, when I've done them before, when I've seen on the other side of the table, this is to the same effect, you can still get that passion through. You can still get that interest through, and just be candid about it, and enjoy it. Treat it like a physical interview. Know that there's those caveats, like we mentioned before with everyone else that was there speaking. Even with the fatigue, I think it's doable.
Great.
So I've got to say, Dan, for my money, I think having a pennant and a shirt really nails the interview.
Well, I was trying to put a pinata in the back. See, I like to make it fun. See, I like to make it fun, right? So I was trying to put engagement. I'm actually in my gym. I'm in my gym, and I do actually have a pinata hanging on the wall because it's crazy in here. But I appreciate it. I try to make it fun. Make it fun, within reason. It's fun stuff.
All right. So one thing I'll ask the both of you, and this harkens back to something Robert said right at the outset. So you're in a virtual interview setting. Joe, like you said, you've got X amount of time. There's multiple candidates. You've got to do something that stands out. You also want to be a little fun. You want to be a little engaging. It seems to me like that's a lot to balance. So if you've got all of that running through your head when you're doing an interview, I'm not sure you can focus on the interview. And maybe I'm being a little unfair to it. Would you say that practice, as was mentioned before, is the thing that sort of overcomes all these things you have to balance? Or should you just be confident in what you do and hope it all works out for the best?
I'm not a fan of winging it. So I've often said to graduating students that the hardest part of the interview should be before you used to be get on site, the interview, meaning the preparation, organization. Robert talked about understanding the industry. Steve talked about understanding the position, the company. This is all preparation, organization that has to be done prior to showing up on site. I guess we heard also about practicing answers. I'm a big fan of memorizing, for example, elevator speech, being clear and concise about what you can deliver to the company in the context of what the company does, as opposed to asking what the company can do for you. Those are the kind of things that if you prepare and organize ahead of time, I think it takes the pressure off during the interview.
That almost sounds similar to a JFK quote. It's not what your country can do for you, what you do for your country, right? Yeah. I agree with that. I agree with that sentiment. But also, when you practice, keep it, loosen up, practice being loose. Again, if you know what your story is, you know why you're coming into this, you know why you want to work for somebody, tell the story, right? I mean, you're not taking it in such perspective that you just kind of, whatever about it. You still want to be professional. You still want to practice. You still want to make sure that you get your points across. And then you also listen to what the interviewer wants to hear from you as well. But you're telling a story, right? So, okay, yeah, you're balancing a bunch of different things. Cool. But at the same time, if you can get across what you want to convey, and you just practice that and understand what you're trying to say, I think you'll be okay. I think you'll do well.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how to keep yourself motivated, how to stay engaged, but also some of the challenges with the fatigue aspect of it. What I want to do now is ask another question about the actual technology and what goes into it. So I mentioned Google Meet, I mentioned Zoom, I mentioned there's WebEx and Microsoft Teams. Looking at some of the larger corporations where we have a lot of alumni working there, I want to ask Robert Cohen and Carlos Orozco what sort of technology you use in your workplace, and hear if there is a differentiation between what you use in the workplace versus interviewing, or if it's the same technology, and what should the class of 2020 member who's about to interview know about using your software for an interview.
Want to start off there, Carlos?
Sure. So within Prudential, we do use MS Team, WebEx, and a variety of different communication platforms. And particularly, depending on the candidate and where they're located, we try to be quite flexible for what's best for them. One of the things that I like to use too is actually something called Wacom, which is a tablet, really, that you can connect and kind of share your screens to work with the team. And because of this virtual setting, sometimes it might not be easy to kind of just look at the screen, but also people want to draw things or talk about a system design and things like that. That's something that if you say you're interviewing for a systems position, it might be useful to kind of bring some of those files or kind of share them ahead of time, just as an idea.
So the technology, we use a Striker Zoom and we use Teams, but we're good for anyone that has a preference, right? Because all that matters is your square box on someone's monitor. And so however you get across. I will say a couple of things relative to technology. There's so many people, if a company prefers to use Teams, let's say, try it first. I can't tell you how many people have delayed interviews because they just tried to get on 15 minutes before. They didn't realize there was an app to download. They had the administrator block on a laptop because maybe they're doing it from a work laptop or a school laptop that couldn't do it, and they weren't prepared for it. Also know and get familiar with the screen, because if you do want to pull up a document and share, sometimes I think that's great. How many times does someone go to an in-person interview with a portfolio, maybe some engineering projects they've done, maybe a journal article that they had, but it's very hard to hand that off. So you want to be able to switch to a screen. You want those files opened on the bottom. You want to be able to share your desktop and do it quickly, and you want it to be seamless, and you want to be able to go back and forth, and you don't want to have the conversation. You don't want to do those pauses. Let me have 20 seconds while I look for this or whatever. You want to be able, so don't have Wi-Fi problems. Go to a Wi-Fi place that's good. Don't have laptop problems where you have a conflict with the software. Get everything ready with what you can, and then Mike, all those technologies will work. Again, it's a little bit of preparation and thinking through the points you want to make.
Gentlemen, thanks so much for that. I think that leads pretty neatly into my next question, which is going to go to Pat Natal and actually back to Manish Advani. So, gentlemen, technology. If you're like me, the second you try to do something goes wrong. And you do it the second time and something else goes wrong. And the third time, fingers crossed, everything works perfectly. There's so much involved in an interview, right? So if you show up to an in-person interview and you screw something up or whatever, you can hopefully overcome that on how you're interacting with people. When you are in a virtual interview and your technology goes to pot, what's the expectation there? You know, is it something, if you're the interviewer, that you're okay that something happens, you give them a certain amount of time, or is it something that, look, this is a bad sign, they didn't prepare well? How would you handle it? And this question I would toss to Pat first.
Interesting question, because we can't fault the individual if the system fails. So that's the first thing we look at, is it can't be the individual's problem because of the technology. We've shifted recently to Microsoft Teams, and we've had limited problems. But I think a comment was made earlier about try it out first. Be prepared, test. If you're going to be on Teams or Zoom, whatever it is, do some testing with it so you're comfortable. I think that's really important, because you don't know what you're going to run into. We also have an interview template and a guide that we send out to interviewees to give them some heads up on things they should try to troubleshoot to be ready. So we found that to be helpful to streamline our process. But keep in mind that this it's a tool, and you need to be prepared. And I think a couple of the comments, I just want to reinforce that it's really important that you prepare, but you can't script everything, because you're going to have an unknown question that you never even thought of. So you need the ability to think on your feet and be responsive, and have all those points that were made earlier about engaging. But we normally give 5 or 10 minutes if there is a glitch, and then we'll look for an alternate way to get back to the individual, because we saw enough in the individual's curriculum that they provided us that we want to talk to that individual. So we wouldn't hold that technology against them.
In my case, I usually recommend, go with plan A and plan B. If plan A fails, you can, activate plan B. So if person is using a laptop, if for some reason the laptop is not working, the microphone's not working, or the video is not working, within 2 minutes, if the person switches to plan B, you're back on track. And the one thing which I recommend to people who are giving interviews is, follow the KISS formula. Keep it short and simple, because that's something works. Even if you lose track, you can easily get back on track, and the person who's interviewing you, he's not confused, where were we, and and it's easy to get back.
So gentlemen, I've got to wonder, has that ever happened to you, where you're interviewing someone or you're interacting with someone and their technology just goes wonky, or yours does? And what kind of follow-up happens if they can't get back on? Do you get an email? Do you get a phone call? What generally happens?
Well, normally I've done the outreach sometimes to be proactive, to let them know we're interested, letting them know that it's unfortunate you had a problem. How can we go forward to help you meet our needs, and hopefully we can make this work? So I think that outreach should be proactive. Now, the individual be wise to do the same thing, which shows that he or she is really interested in joining our firm.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you so much. So my next question has to do specifically with our class of 2020. Now, this webinar series is part of an overall series for the class of 2020 to talk about some of the skills that you may need to acquire over the next couple months to the next couple years. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Steve Saperstein and Dan Cerrone to join me. And Steve, I'd like to start with you for this question. If you had a member of the class of 2020 sitting right here in front of you, and I know that you've got a lot of experience with this based on the number of alumni who work at Prudential now, what is differentiating them, whether it be in a digital interview or an in-person interview, from someone else, from all the other qualified candidates? What is going to make that person stand out?
Start with the resume. So that's your first gateway into the company. Obviously, highlight projects that you worked on. Obviously, higher GPA is better. At this point, that's pretty much set for the class of 2020. But you want to be able to clearly articulate everything in your resume and personalize it. Talk about how you worked on a project and you took the lead, or if there was an issue with another individual working on that project, how you resolved it. So kind of just look at your resume. Don't take it for a list of stuff. Take it for real life actions and experiences that you had, and really be able to talk about it, own it. And like I said earlier with the question, show a passion for what you did. If you show a passion for a project and really can talk detail, that shows me that you know what you're doing. If you're talking very high level and not being able to really address things that are on your resume, that's weak. So, that's always been my my advice. And people that talk with a passion, talk in detail, and can relate in detail to what's on their resume will do well. So that's the advice that I'd lay forward.
And Dan, what about you?
I was going to say, so I second that completely. I will say, like I've said before, with regards to resume, and I've said this at fairs as well, is that's your foot in the door. That gets people interested. That's your, I guess you want to call it your sales pitch, maybe. All that information, just like Steve said, you should be able to talk to, and you should be passionate about. It should tell your story, right? If I can look at a resume and it excites me, right? I mean, like, it looks like something that's a really great resume. They got a lot of things on there that may jive with the company. Can you talk to it? Is it something that you're passionate about, that you enjoy, that you can explain? But yeah, you got to make sure that you're able to do those things when you get into the interview.
One more point I wanted to make, and it actually isn't for the class of 2020. It's for any rising seniors or juniors that are participating. In financial services, a lot of the financial services companies have gone to completely virtual processes without actually anybody interviewing you on the other side. So you're prompted with questions and you're recorded on how you answer the questions. And actually AI helps assess how your truly virtual interview is going. And, JP Morgan, Prudential, lots of the large financial services firms use these platforms. HireView is the one that we used at Prudential. Carlos is obviously familiar with it as well. And that's your initial window into the company. The people who apply for the jobs are whittled down based on that completely virtual, without a person on the other side interview. So, and it's probably a little disconcerting when you're being asked questions and recorded when there isn't even a person on the other side. So that's truly the extreme of virtual interviewing that, the rising juniors and seniors have to get used to, because that's a big part. If you're interested in the financial services world, I know that's a big part of how they broaden the net for recruiting.
Steve, that's something I've actually heard from a lot of our recent graduates. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them are really struggling with how to overcome that. I don't know whether you know or not that you've been weeded out because of technology, or if it's an in-person, you probably can't figure it out in some ways. Are there certain things that they should be aware of when they're applying, when they're sending it, that might help them? Or is it really just, look, you are who you are, and
it's back to what I said before. So when they develop the technology, they interview the managers and executives in the company. What's important to you? What types of questions are important to you? What types of responses are good? What do you look for in the candidate? And the artificial intelligence really weighs through that. Occasionally, we'll override that. You'll see somebody with a really high GPA and like, why they get weeded out? And then we'll watch the recording and say, yeah, I think this person should go to the next level.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. All right, so my next question is going to come in the form of more specific job requirements. So we just heard from Steve talking about AI and how those things are sort of tailored, and he mentioned financial services. Well, lots of different industries have very particular sets of requirements. And when you're presenting yourself in a virtual interview, clearly it can be an alternative method to talk about what you've done, whether through project management or so on. So why don't we pull up Joe Racanelli and Pat Natal? All right. So Pat, you work at Mott McDonald. Joe, you work at Stryker. These are companies in very specific fields that have pretty high requirements in their respective areas. So how does a candidate explain their work experience with a lot of detail when you've got artificial intelligence on the one side, possibly, you've got a set limited amount of time on the other? What does your ideal hire do to make sure they're not talking too long, but they're also going in depth on the sort of things that are really relevant to you? And Joe, I'm going to pass this off to you first.
Sure, thanks. I think there's a couple of key things. Again, some of these themes you'll hear over and over about. It's clear when people are prepared, they come in. One of the key things they're able to do, and you heard it earlier, tell a story coherently, effectively, and concisely about what experience they bring. If you have a co-op or a summer internship, if you have lab experience or a senior project experience that you believe has relevance, bring that in, present it clearly, concisely. The other challenge I'll make to the graduates and up and comings as well is that technology can also be your friend, right? So Robert mentioned, making sure the platform you're on, you're able to open up windows. If you've prepared, for example, let's say you did your senior project and you have a really couple of cool, mechanical drawings, or you have a circuit design, or whatever your background is, if that's prepared and you can bring that up in the context of explaining that experience, let's say a co-op experience, for example, it's very powerful because it presents a clear, concise understanding of what you did, why you did it. So that's important. The other thing I think, just to step back, sometimes people come in and they'll present information, but they don't present context. So for example, what this industry you did your co-op in, or your senior project, what was the problem you're really trying to solve? What was your specific contribution? How did you work with the team? So I think to the question, the point is to get out there and assume you're going to have to explain yourself shortly and concisely, and then that actually fosters conversation as opposed to chewing up time that, let's say, could be wasted by going into long technical details that may not be relevant.
Great comments, Joe. I agree with everything you said. I think it's important to understand the company. Have you done research on the company? What do they do? What's their company culture? Look online and find out what the company is all about, what they do. And then you can do the connection, as Joe described, explaining it. But if you connect it, if you can connect your project, your senior project, to the kind of work that the company does, you're now getting the attention, and you're showing that you understand what they're doing. One other thing that I also encourage people is to be prepared at the end of the interview to ask questions. I always looked at it as an interview. When I interview with folks throughout my career, I was interviewing them too. I wanted to see if they were the kind of company or organization I chose to be with. So I found it always interesting at the end. Do you have any questions? I had a series of questions that I had prepared that I was ready to ask to make a decision. So if they made an offer later on and it's not the company I choose, that's a decision I have to make. And the other thing that was mentioned earlier about recording yourself, I really encourage that, because you don't know how you're coming across. Have you really worked on your communication skills? Are you presenting the points the way you want to? So the interviewer has the ability to make that selection. In fact, one of the questions I used to ask candidates, I'm seeing a lot of really talented people. Tell me why you're the best and why I should hire you. And it's interesting to see the responses that I got from people. And many of those responses helped me make the final decision to make the offer. Yeah,
so Pat, I agree with those comments. I would like to just kind of go back and resonate on one thing, that from a person who's sitting looking at somebody who's talking to me about why they should come to work. For me, for example, there's always two groupings. Back to the technical issue. One, there's some technical competence that we expect out of people, and clearly, if you just graduated from college with the BS, there's an expectation about a certain level of competence, and so it's reasonable not to have all the answers, but you certainly should have some perspective. But also, there's a soft skill set. So we want people that also fit in the company, right? So when you're interviewing, think for example, let's say you're asked a technical question. Maybe you don't know the right answer, but it's fair to say, well, I really didn't work in that area, but I can love to look into it and get back to you on that or something. But what I would do, and I would typically follow up by saying, okay, in a work environment, how would you deal with that? And sometimes the answer that people give is more, let's say, informative about their work style than the actual technical discussion we might have had. So keep in mind the soft skills and the technical competence as two components of an interview.
Yeah, and not only the technical. Earlier in my career, I worked in a marketing organization. So I was looking to hire engineers with different skill sets than the typical engineer. I didn't want them to be the R&D type engineer, which are important, but I didn't need them. I needed somebody to go out and talk to clients about what we provided, the services we offered, and those communication skills jumped to the top. They were more important because I assumed that they were graduating in an engineering degree. They had the baseline. We were going to teach them the technical side of our business, and then eventually the sales aspect. So they need to be prepared for that wide variety of questions that could come across the board.
Gentlemen, thanks so much. So I'm actually going to keep you on the screen here. We're going to take some of our questions from the audience now. And here I want to invite all of our panelists to stick around for me. So why don't we start with the first question from Salandra. I think it's a pretty interesting question. She's been told that a portfolio in the form of a website would be good for applications and interviews. I think we should start with, is this something that an employer, you guys in this case, would want to take a look at? Is it worthwhile for the student or the class of 2020 member to do? And if so, what is it that you'd want to see on that portfolio website? And this is an open question, so whoever would like to go, just go ahead and pitch in.
I'll start off and say there's no hard answer for that question, because it depends on what type of job you're looking for, right? So if you're going for architecture, absolutely, it's a way to compile things, categorize things, make it easy, and leave it behind for someone if they wanted to do further work. I think for the type of R&D roles that we have, I think we'd rather talk more to the person, have the person articulate, not for us to look, but articulate what it is that's very relevant to either what they think the company is or the job that they're trying for. The more linkage they could either do to that job opportunity, if it's a very specific job, and more to show their experiences, whether at the college level or whether summer internship level, or if they had some other work experience, tying those together is actually more important. There's so many things right now that are very specific that are technology that, you're just not going to be an expert on until you work at a company. So you don't have to be an expert. It's how you want to show what you've done. And I can tell you, if you open up 10 different files on the bottom of your Zoom and you go back in and out and you share screen and you give me enough tasting of that, I don't have to be an expert. Talk confidently, talk relative to what your experience was, prove it to me by showing me some of the things. And then I think I'm good. There's only so much time to make a point across. Sometimes these websites, which we've seen, take you into such a deep dive, you're actually using too much of a majority of time during the interview process. And honestly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it after.
Yeah, I agree with that, the time availability. For example, I was looking at some data earlier today. At 1 year, we had 10,700 applications and we hired 500 people. So just think about the volume. Could you be doing that deep dive that Robert was just talking about on 10,000? We would probably get through 1,000 of them. So I think something like that is useful to have. Maybe it's something as we go further down the process, but during the early parts of the interviews, I just don't see the talent acquisition teams having the time to do that kind of deep dive.
One thing I would suggest, though, just as a baseline, I for sure agree with what was said. Think about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is pretty much a social media, but for a professional network. So while it's not a website, you do want to have a very clean and polished profile so that when talent acquisition Googles your name, what shows up? You just want to make sure that all of whatever Facebook and all of that is polished. You probably don't want to make that too public. Keep it professional and have a LinkedIn profile instead of a website. Kind of show, and here's the kind of projects I worked in. It's very polished, very simple. I would recommend that.
I could jump in there too. Just from, I guess, what I do, right? So I have a website. I have two, one for DJing and one for actually a book I published. So in my master's, I did a thesis on different systems engineering processes, and I came up with something that allows people to work on systems engineering processes even if they're a lay person, right? So I published a book. I have it available online. You can go to the website. You can learn about the book. You can purchase the book, blah, blah, blah. So anytime that I bring up that reference, I say, well, check out my website, but it's very geared specifically towards that topic, right? So I'm not on there like word vomiting about me, right? To Carlos's point, that's what LinkedIn is for, right? So if you have a brand that you're creating around yourself, and it's specific to something that you're passionate about or something that you do and you do well, like whether it be race car driving or building rockets or whatever, right? And that's something that you have a website about and it has something to do with relevancy to what you're doing in this position that you're looking for, mention it, and maybe it's something that people will follow up on. But again, I agree with everybody else here. It's probably not something that, everybody's going to be parsing through,
So in my case, I have made a video in which I have shared the lessons I've learned from different jobs. It's a short video which I have made. So in addition to LinkedIn, in LinkedIn, you also have, I agree to what Carlos said. So in LinkedIn, you can also have, there's a features option. You can even, post some of your videos and top it up with what you have listed in LinkedIn. So, instead of, creating a separate website, I think LinkedIn could be a good starting point you can consider.
So, I think that brings us into one of the next questions from our audience here that I think is pretty interesting. Let's say your GPA is decent, but you've really done outstanding work, projects, and so on. How are you able to show that in a way that's going to maybe offset the conversation about GPA? Steve, I know this is something that you sort of mentioned before a little bit yourself. GPA is high up there. Work experience obviously balances in there. What would you say to the student whose GPA isn't quite where they might hope it would be?
Well, there's going to be a floor. So, and every company kind of has a soft floor. Anybody with a GPA below that floor, the resumes don't get looked at. So, and then if you leave your GPA off your resume, that's a red flag. So then, even if it's decent, it's completely going to not get looked at. But if it's decent, like the person mentioned, then you're above it. You're going to get looked at, and then it really is about the projects and your experiences. That's going to enhance things, and you're going to be looked at more favorably versus somebody maybe with a higher GPA that didn't have those experiences. So absolutely, what you said in your question is spot on. But you do need the GPA above what that minimum is. Otherwise, you're kind of dead in the water, really, with certain companies.
The question is an interesting question because it's the question relative to how to apply to a company, or is the question how to handle that in an interview? Because if you got to the point of interview, you've met the minimum threshold to actually get the interview. So therefore, it's no longer about your GPA. The GPA, because there are so many people who apply to jobs, the GPA it just gets cut out, and it's one of the screening triggers. Now, if you get in and it's a choice between someone who got a 3.2 and someone who got a 3.5, now it's your confidence in your interviewing, it's your experiences you brought forward, and it's a demonstration of your work. You have to be really articulate. If you're coming in with a marginal GPA, talk to the points, but now you have a harder time where you have to correlate your experiences to that specific job description. Many people don't do that. They just show, hey, look what I did. Look what I did. I'm a really good student. Look what I did. It's not my job to figure out the relevance of that to that job. So confidence, understanding how to link it together. And then I think you're okay. If you got to the point of the interview, people are moving past your GPA.
One of the other things I would add, things I used to look at, what was the other involvement that student had? Were they involved in their society, whether it's civil engineers or AICHE for the chemical engineers or ASME? Are they involved? Are they a leader in one of their groups? Do they lead one of their teams, the Baja team or the concrete canoe team? So depending on what the company is looking for, are they showing engagement and teaming, and are they showing leadership skills? They may be more valuable than the higher GPA, as Robert talked about. So what is the full package you bring to the table?
Yeah. I would add as well, just for the students to always remember that if you're interviewing in a company, even if the job you're interviewing for, maybe we decide halfway through or after you interview you're not a good fit. Oftentimes, for strong candidates, we'll refer those candidates to other departments. So, for example, where I work in MAWA here, we have operations people, quality people. We have a host of slots, and at times we have suggested people interview for other jobs and that haven't fit in our world, for example, and they've been hired. So I think it's a great question. It just talks again to owning what you've accomplished, being proud of it, and communicating it clearly and concisely. It goes a long way.
Thank you, gentlemen. So now we've got one last question from the audience here, which I think is interesting and maybe a little bit out of the blue. What sort of career fairs did all of you attend, and how did you prepare for the career fair experience? I know we've got a wide array of folks on the interview here, so if this is relevant to you, I'm kind of curious myself. Did you go to a career fair? Did you take advantage of some of these things? And what did you do when you were that age doing that sort of stuff?
I think people should only respond if they graduated in the year 2000 or after.
All right, so I'll go.
Good, then I'll respond.
So
I'll respond. At least I'm in the last decade. No offense, everybody.
One of the things that I think is pretty useful, particularly with career fairs, is the ability to network, right? You have to have the confidence in yourself to just go reach out to people and ask different questions. As I was gearing up to get into the financial industry, yes, I connected with a couple of different finance conferences that I went to just to learn more about the industry, have practice on how to just have a 2-3 minute introduction of yourself, and whether they have a happy hour right after, just to be able to connect with people. I think networking is a very, very useful tool to have, particularly at the entry level for your role, for an entry level role rather. In this setting, in this virtual setting, one of the things that I've seen people have Brazen, it's BRAZEN. It's a platform that a variety of organizations use to have virtual conferences. And essentially, it's no different than connecting with a recruiting person, a 2-3 minute kind of chat box and individual chat, and being able to connect. You can switch that to video if need be too. But get familiar with Brazen. I think it's a very useful tool, whether you're an engineer, whether you're looking into management or other type of roles. I think in this setting, having ability to use Brazen is a very good tool, regardless of the conference.
I think it's irrelevant where fairs I went to, since it was in the dark ages. But I think what's more important is the fairs that Mott MacDonald participates to find people. And we are very aggressive for participating with NJIT because we hired a lot of NJIT alum. Our CEO is an NJIT alum. But one of the things, side issue, we also are participating in the National Society of Black Engineers and the Society of Women Engineers. But you have opportunities to run into people all over. And I'll give you a brief story about where some of our students dropped the ball. There was a conference at ASCE, and the keynote speaker was Nick DiNiccolo, our CEO. And there was a team there from NJIT, and he was introduced as an alum of NJIT. Not one student from NJIT went up and said hello to him. People from Rider, people from Manhattan, people from other universities went over and said hello to him. And every one of them ended up with an internship at Mott MacDonald. When you have an opportunity, you go to a meeting and Robert Cohen's there. Go talk to him. You never know when you might get an internship there. So take an opportunity to reach out and engage with the alum.
And I'm going to jump in here for a second. So I also want to make a quick pitch. As I mentioned when we began this webinar is part of a series of webinars for the class of 2020, for students, for young alumni in general. The actual first webinar was from the Young Alumni Association Executive Committee, talking about what your network is, the value of that network, how it can be both professional and personal, and how to leverage that, which really parallels, I think, this conversation. So for all those folks watching, make sure to check out our YouTube channel. You also find it as a podcast on Google Podcast, Apple, and Spotify, and you'll see it on our website as well. But I think that networking piece is kind of a great lead-in to our, I'm going to say, our second to last question here, which is, are all of you here, would you consider being a resource for the class of 2020 members who are out there right now? And have you been a resource? You know, how have people approached you, or how do you prefer to be approached when there's a student or a recent graduate who's looking for some assistance? Why don't I start, actually, Steve, with you, because I know Prudential has had a really amazing network, very formalized with this. So, you know, I know you've been a resource. What's the best approach that a class of 2020 member might have if they were to come up to you when you were recently at Prudential?
I always appreciate people contact me on LinkedIn, you know, if they connect with me and they're NJIT graduate or student, I will always take the connection. And you know, if they've done their background work and their homework and they seem good, then, you know, we can have a conversation.
Okay. Anybody else? I know there's actually one of the reasons why you guys have volunteered here today, and I've been very pleased by it, is you have a lot of alumni working at your corporation. So Dan, what about you? I know you're frequently in touch with other alumni at Schneider and some of the other places you've been. If somebody from 2020 comes up to you and says, "Hey Dan, can you help me out?" What do you say?
I say absolutely, but I'm not going to do all the work. We need to work together in order to do something that, you know, to move forward, right? So I was actually going to mention on the, just quickly on that point about the career fair. And maybe it's because now it's kind of like, you know, 7.5 years now with Schneider. I always appreciate people who are looking for a good fit for them. Not just, I need a job, right? And then they're just coming out there and they're just trying to throw 1,000 resumes around and see what sticks. Again, it goes back to the story. Is this company a good fit for me? Does this make sense for me too, right? If you come into the room and you're there just as much to interview the interviewee as they're interviewing you because you're thoroughly interested, number one, that's great, you know, because now you can really jive with them, or maybe not. And two, you really can learn if that is the right position for you, right? If that's the right place for you. But to the point of helping everybody out, absolutely. They can always reach out to me. Anybody can always reach out to me. I just ask that whatever it is, you know, it's pointed and it's something that you come with an agenda. It's not just help me. What with what, right? What are we doing, right? So let's do that kind of stuff, right? But yeah, absolutely.
You know, and to that end, so Manish, we had the opportunity to do a Highlander chat a couple months ago, and even kind of working the time frame, right? Because you're actually in India, and it's one of those things where you have to balance a little bit about being respectful of your time and finding time here. How about you? You know, a class of 2020 member says, "Hey, look, I want to set something up." What's the first thing that you say to them, knowing that you may not be physically in the same place, the same time zone, or even the same continent?
So I'd be more than happy to help, you know, any one of them. What I would say, you know, chase problems. So, you know, many a times people get into the trap of chasing success. My advice would be chase problems. And if you chase problems, you know, money and, you know, success will be behind you. Because if you are chasing problems and helping the organization solve those problems, I think you're on your way.
All right.
And I would be more than happy to, you know, connect them. I mean, I know a lot of people, so.
Champion networker.
Mike, could I provide some comments to that?
Please do.
So I get people, yeah, I do a bunch of stuff and get a lot of exposure at NJIT. So always happy to help out NJIT people, right? I mean, we're not part of NJIT to the extent while we're working, we're not students anymore, but there's always a part of us that's NJIT. So that never leaves us. I'll tell you, I always appreciate talking to students when I see students. Always appreciate going to product fairs and understanding product fairs. Always appreciate good questions. I can tell you what I don't appreciate. I don't appreciate someone who emails me because they see I'm from NJIT on LinkedIn and says, hey, I need a job. Do you have any jobs available? Because now you just dumped it on me. And I can't tell you how many people do that. And no, I'm not going to go to the Stryker website for you to look for a job that may be open. And I don't appreciate that either, by the way. If somebody, and everyone's here has probably had those same kind of inquiries, right? If someone says, I see there's a job opening, and if they say, hey, you know what, based on my experience, my school experience, internship experience, and whatever experience, I think I'm ideal for that position. Can you help me understand? Now, all of us have compliance, things like that. So just because you ask us, I don't think anyone here can automatically get someone a job. But certainly to coach on interviewing process, to coach on the interview, to even review a resume to see if the resume will have impact. I think we can offer a lot of value to people like that if it's for a targeted position or whatnot. So definitely we want to help. Just know that we want to help is not, hey, can you get me a job? And as simple as that.
Yeah, just echo what Robert said. The premise is that we would like to help people who are trying to get placed in a position they feel they can add value, as opposed to just getting a job. Dan said it, right? We don't, if you come out looking for a job, any job, that's not, let's say, an appropriate way to proceed. And we're happy to help people who have a path, they see a fit, and they see a kind of some logic around it, and we can maybe help guide that. That's what makes sense to me.
I'm afraid to apply for a job with Dan, so I'm with you.
Well, gentlemen, it sounds like we have the makings of a future panel discussion here. So I want to take some time and just thank all of you again for participating today. I know you're all busy and this is in the middle of the workday, but as dedicated alumni volunteers, as alumni leaders, as resources to the class of 2020, and as your executive director of alumni relations, I want to thank you for taking the time. It means a lot to us. It means a lot to the school. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for
Thank
doing
you.
it.
Thanks, Mike.
Good luck 2020.
So you've heard from our panel discussion. Again, I want to reiterate that this has been a service offered to the class of 2020, but it is also open to our new students. Please reach out to us if you have questions. Please post questions in the comments on YouTube here, and we will make sure to pass those along to any of the panel participants. Make sure also to catch all of our previous webinars that have been offered. Again, it's here on the channel, or you can visit us at our podcast sites at Apple, Google, and Spotify. Finally, there will be more panel discussions coming up next week, next Thursday. In fact, you will be witnessing a panel discussing how to build your career from day one at a company. And then the week after that, it will be a discussion from our regional leaders about what it's like to live in the rest of the country. So please do stay in touch. I look forward to reconnecting with you again soon, and go Highlanders.